London's GDP per capita ranks among the highest in the world, on par with entire countries, while regions like the Northeast produce less than half that per person. Same country, very different economies. This isn't just regional inequality. It's a blueprint for collapse disguised by one city's glittering success. By the end of this video, you'll know how that gap affects jobs, house prices, and your bank balance, and one practical step people can take today. To understand how we got here, we need to look back at a time when the UK still believed its economy was unstoppable. From empire builder to economic warning sign. At the turn of the millennium, the UK still looked like a confident economic story. Growth was steady, trade volumes were expanding, and the pivot from heavy industry to a services-dominated model seemed like it might deliver lasting prosperity. That sense of momentum has since faded. Growth has been weak and uneven in recent years, with only modest quarterly gains, such as around plus 0.3% in Q2 2025, and a productivity record that continues to lag many peers. What was once a model for economic reinvention is now more often cited abroad as a warning about what happens when an economy is left to drift. The contrast is stark for a country that once built rail networks overseas, dominated global trade routes, and shaped financial systems that others copied. The shift hasn't been dramatic enough to trigger a crisis headline, but the long-term erosion is visible in the statistics. Productivity per worker has slipped steadily down the international rankings, with each hour worked in the UK now generating less value than in France, Germany, or Canada. The OECD continues to record a widening gap. Real wage growth for most workers has been flat since the global financial crisis, and living costs for essentials repeatedly outpace pay packets. The OBR and other analyses have noted that Brexit and persistent underinvestment have kept productivity several percentage points below where it otherwise could be, a drag that compounds year after year. Too many short-term political moves, tax headlines, brief incentives, and start infrastructure, added up into structural underinvestment. The result: weak productivity and flat real wages for many. ONS data and economic briefings confirm that weak improvement in productivity is now one of the most persistent features of the UK economy in 2025. It's not a single policy failure, but a pattern, repeated across governments, of favoring immediate boosts over long-term stability. Much of the political conversation still leans on an older national image, flattered by the UK's mid-20th century influence and reach. That nostalgia softens the perception of weakness, creating a belief that the country's stature alone can buffer against stagnation. But the numbers tell a different story. Output per head barely growing, high-value exports losing ground, and investment in capacity concentrated in narrow sectors rather than spread across regions and industries. If you looked only at certain sectors, particularly finance, you could conclude Britain is still strong. Yet that concentration is part of the problem economists highlight. Growth driven by a small cluster of industries in a small geographic area hides the fragility elsewhere. When these sectors underperform, the lack of balance in the economy becomes painfully clear. Domestic consumption growth has been slow because wages remain static and productivity improvements have largely stalled. Gains in the capital have not translated into broadly shared prosperity. This pattern, initial success in drawing investment into finance, the gradual hollowing out of manufacturing and regional industry, and reluctance to diversify, is now part of policy case studies on how an economy can falter during the shift to a high-value service model. Other countries facing similar transitions have made deliberate moves to lift skills, attract varied industries, and spread investment. In the UK, successive governments have maintained a narrow focus, preferring to reinforce already dominant sectors. When political cycles demand quick results, decisions trend toward the expedient. Tax cuts without the fiscal space to support them, incentives that favor property over productive business investment, and austerity phases that cut into infrastructure and education have all contributed to the current malaise. Each choice was defended at the time as sensible or necessary. Together, they traded long-term resilience for temporary gains. By the middle of the 2020s, this approach has produced a kind of managed stagnation. GDP growth remains low, not as a momentary dip, but as the baseline expectation. Workers face rising costs for essentials such as energy and transport without corresponding income growth. Policy-induced barriers still limit the spread of productivity gains, from delayed infrastructure upgrades to outdated education, priorities that fail to supply skills in emerging fields. The challenge is persistence. Countries hit by sudden shocks sometimes use the disruption to overhaul their economic models. Britain has slid too gradually for that kind of reset. Politicians speak of opportunity and leadership, but the underlying measures, output per capita, share of high-value exports, productivity growth, continue to weaken relative to most peers. Internationally, Britain is now less a template to follow and more a cautionary chart in comparative economic analysis. Where its deregulation wave once set trends, the UK is now often used to illustrate the risks of overdependence on a single growth engine. Economies with smaller financial hubs, but more even regional development point to Britain as proof that headline GDP from one city cannot disguise structural imbalances forever. In teaching materials and consultancy reports, the UK's early 2000s trajectory appears as a promising launch that plateaus and then falls behind peer averages. Decline here didn't come with a crash. It unfolded quietly, with each year of modest returns compounding the gap. Leaders and media attention often gravitated to isolated successes. A strong quarter in the city, a major tech listing, a new trade announcement, while the overall trend continued downward. And at each stage, there were opportunities to act differently. Targeting investment to boost productivity in underperforming regions, developing new sectors alongside finance, or updating education to meet future rather than past demands. Instead, the choice to double down on the country's most lucrative sector has been deliberate and sustained. It has produced the appearance of stability, but also deepened vulnerability. By 2025, the indicators that once signaled room for course correction have shifted into confirmation of long-term underperformance. Even optimistic forecasts struggle to put the UK back among the leaders within the current model. And while there are still clear centers of exceptional economic activity, their strength also makes the imbalance more pronounced. The concentration of growth, investment, and opportunity in one place sets the stage for the next, sharper contrast between the fortunes of the nation as a whole and the performance of the capital. London's glow, nation's shadow. In 2025, London still punches far above its weight. It ranks among the world's top financial centers in foreign exchange and wealth management. And City of London figures show financial services remain the UK's leading service export, generating roughly $160 billion in revenue in 2023. That scale of activity feeds directly into the national accounts and props up the government's fiscal position. When measured separately, London's per capita GDP rivals entire countries. The rest of Britain lags far behind, with many regions still yet to regain pre-pandemic productivity levels. Move away from the capital, and the contrast is immediate. In parts of the Northeast, Midlands, or coastal towns, private investment can be close to non-existent. High streets carry more boarded-up windows than open shops, and in some areas, employment never returned to pre-2008 levels. ONS data shows clear disparities in GDP per head, median incomes, and even population growth patterns, with younger workers leaving for jobs in London or moving abroad entirely. London's position in the global finance hierarchy is deeply entrenched. Only New York consistently ranks higher overall, and in some niches, such as foreign exchange trading, insurance underwriting, and legal arbitration, London still leads the world. This status draws in international firms, attracted by its regulatory framework, time zone, and dense concentration of specialist services. These headline strengths shape the way Britain's economy is perceived abroad, masking the picture on the ground in much of the country. Beyond finance, the story changes. Manufacturing output now occupies a smaller share of GDP than at any point since industrialization began, and hospitality faces closures under the strain of higher energy costs, persistent staffing gaps, and weaker domestic demand. Retail in many towns is reduced to a handful of supermarkets and charity shops. Local councils in post-industrial regions operate under restrictive budgets, unable to fund the kind of regeneration projects that might reverse decline. If you average all this out with London's figures, it can distort the national story entirely. The structure of available work reflects the divide. In the city, demand for analysts, compliance specialists, and fund managers stays high, with salaries well above national medians. In smaller cities or rural areas, available roles tend to be short-term positions in care, warehousing, or hospitality, with hourly pay rates barely advancing in real terms over the last decade. This separation in job types influences local skill bases, migration flows, and housing demand in very different ways. Financial services now make up a greater proportion of the economy than before the global financial crisis, the deregulation of the 1980s, or the post-war industrial contraction. With that concentration, national growth can appear solid when finance performs well, even if most other industries are stagnant or shrinking. But this also raises systemic risk, vulnerability to shifts in global markets, regulatory changes overseas, or technological innovations that could undercut the sector's dominance. Government revenue shows the dependence clearly. Tax receipts from the capital's financial sector contribute a disproportionately large share toward funding national public services. If this revenue stream fell sharply, no other sector could replace it quickly, leaving the fiscal position exposed. In more balanced economies, downturns in one sector are offset by others. Britain lacks that redundancy. Official reports acknowledge the concentration in careful language, while the public conversation rarely highlights it directly. Outside the capital, winning inward investment is far harder. Regional transport and digital infrastructure often lag behind comparable EU cities. Persistent skills gaps remain, fueled by graduate migration out of the regions. Business parks sit underused, not through lack of facilities, but due to too little local demand to sustain them. Far from closing over time, many of these competitiveness gaps have widened. London's property market reinforces the concentration of economic activity. High demand for premium office space keeps the financial hub anchored in the city center. Even the global shift toward remote work has had less impact here than in many other capitals, and the proximity of law firms, auditors, IT consultants, and specialist suppliers strengthens the finance cluster. This efficiency works for the sector, but also keeps economic power tightly bound to one location. Some voices frame this as a strategic advantage. Britain has found its competitive edge and should double down. The counterpoint is persuasive, that such reliance creates fragility. Other nations with strong financial sectors, such as Switzerland and Singapore, also maintain globally competitive manufacturing, logistics, or technology bases. Britain's weakness outside finance means less capacity to cushion shocks or distribute growth more evenly. The split shapes political priorities. Decision-makers immersed daily in London's success may underestimate the depth or persistence of regional decline. National strategies lean heavily on tools that work in the capital. Tax incentives, tweaks to regulation, partnerships with large multinationals. But these measures have limited use in places without major investors to court. This mismatch between conditions on the ground and policymaker assumptions risks locking in the divide. Migration trends deepen the gap. Young, skilled workers relocate to London for finance or allied roles, draining capacity from their hometowns. Rates of business start UPS outside the capital have dropped, partly because potential founders leave before launching. This removes not just spending power, but also the human capital needed to support local recovery. Over time, low growth deters investment, and low investment keeps growth low, a cycle that becomes harder to break. What is distinct in 2025 is the clarity of the data. With the financial sector's share of the economy at modern highs, there's little ambiguity about the imbalance. London's performance reflects the success of a narrow set of activities in a limited physical area, while much of the country manages ongoing structural stagnation. The greater the reliance, the wider and more immediate the impact if that sector hits trouble. What this means for you: if you don't work in London finance, your career and pay trajectory look much different, and understanding that matters for job strategy and relocation choices. And the effects of this imbalance aren't confined to jobs or wages. They show up in everyday costs that touch everyone, no matter where they live. The housing crisis breaks the meter. One of the clearest ways this national imbalance shows itself is in the housing market, where price trends have detached almost entirely from local incomes. Housing affordability is worse than in most of recent memory. In England, median house prices were about 7.7 times median full-time earnings in 2024, according to ONS figures, making ownership far harder for many first-time buyers. Mortgages that once looked like a stretch are now outright unreachable without significant family support, and even solid professional salaries can't bridge the gap. For younger adults, the idea of buying a home has shifted from a life milestone to a statistical outlier. The usual advice to save for a deposit breaks down when the amount you need rises faster than your savings can grow. Multiple forces push those prices upwards. Demand is swelled by investor activity from both UK and overseas buyers, drawn by the relative stability of British property and its potential for capital gains. In many cases, the priority is asset growth, not occupancy, which keeps the pool of available homes for residents tight. On the other side of the equation, supply is persistently weak. New building falls short of what's needed to stabilize the market. Homes England data for 2024 to 25 shows around 38,308 starts and 36,872 completions, figures that are well below long-term targets. Planning delays, rising material and labor costs, and political opposition to higher density housing all slow delivery further. And the pattern is no longer confined to the capital. Regional centers, once valued for relative affordability, are seeing sharp jumps. A modest terrace in a northern city can now trigger competitive bidding, not just from local residents, but from higher-earning remote workers based in London or abroad. Coastal towns have seen price inflation fueled by second home purchases, putting many properties out of reach for local earners and displacing residents to less connected areas. The result is growing separation between where people work and where they can live, undermining both productivity and community stability. Physical stock quality doesn't necessarily offer relief. Houses with outdated heating, structural issues, or visible damp still attract multiple offers because buyers fear that waiting will only push them further out of the market. Any necessary renovation is an additional financial burden, whether borrowed or funded slowly over years. Conditions are equally competitive in the rental sector. Constrained supply pushes rents up faster than general inflation, and competition for each tenancy can be intense. In busier markets, it's common for landlords to request extensive advance payments. Government statements often point to post-pandemic building activity as evidence that the crisis is being addressed, but the numbers don't support a meaningful shift. Modest additions to the housing stock are quickly absorbed by a mix of population growth, accumulated demand from years of underbuilding, and investor acquisitions. Even modest interest rate increases have not brought down prices in high-demand zones. For those relying on mortgages, borrowing now costs more. For cash buyers, little changes. The shortage of social and affordable housing deepens the divide. Council housing stock lost through sales or demolition has not been replaced at the scale needed, and waiting lists for affordable units have grown to record lengths. Low-income households are often left to source rentals in the private market, where housing benefit payments fill part of the gap, but also help sustain high rent levels. Without significant new public provision, pressure in the private sector remains unrelieved. Property ownership in this climate has become a decisive factor in household wealth. Those who bought before the steepest rises, or who inherited property, have seen their net worth climb without active effort. Those without such advantages face long-term renting or high-debt purchases far from economic centers. In the aggregate, investment is pulled toward holding and trading property rather than into productive activities like business expansion or workforce training, reinforcing low productivity growth. The broader economic impacts reach beyond individuals' living situations. High housing costs reduce labor mobility. Employers in sectors from healthcare to education report difficulty recruiting for roles in expensive regions, as salaries do not match local housing markets. For those who do buy, affordable locations can mean long, costly commutes that eat into disposable income, personal time, and well-being. Urban development schemes sometimes claim to address these needs, but many end up focused on higher-margin units aimed at investors. Marketing materials often highlight projected yields or long-term value gains over local wage compatibility. This turns potential housing solutions into further vehicles for investment, repeating the cycle in which property functions more as a store of wealth than as shelter. Periods of strong international demand for UK property highlight the lack of effective countermeasures. Proposals for higher taxes on foreign buyers or limits on bulk investor purchases are debated, but often softened or delayed. The same factors attracting outside capital, legal stability, currency diversification, and market transparency make it harder for local residents to compete. The ripple now extends into smaller, less obvious markets. University towns see steady conversion of family housing into multiple student lets, squeezing young families out. Rural communities face development restrictions for environmental or heritage reasons that keep supply low. As commuter belts expand outward, demand from urban professionals raises prices, even in areas with weaker local economies, establishing a broad price floor across the country. Rental data from 2025 shows both nominal and inflation-adjusted rents at record highs nationally. Limited supply means landlords can increase rates yearly without losing tenants. Formal rent controls exist only in isolated cases, leaving most tenants exposed to rising costs. A growing share of households spend more than 40% of income on rent, a threshold associated with financial stress. That level of housing expense cuts into retail spending, leisure activity, and savings rates, feeding back into slower local economies. While some officials frame high property prices as a signal of confidence, the distribution of benefits tells another story. Gains concentrate among current owners, while the excluded majority face long-term disadvantages. Various buyer assistance schemes have made limited difference, and in some cases have simply channeled more purchasing power into a fixed supply market, adding to price pressure. By mid-decade, the housing market operates almost as a parallel economy, driven by its own momentum rather than by improvements in productivity or incomes. Underbuilding, investor-driven demand, and policy inertia keep prices high, and small market dips are quickly erased as demand returns. For those shut out, the barrier is structural, not temporary. If you're buying now, consider being realistic on location, weighing the long-term costs of renting versus owning, and exploring shared ownership or new build schemes. But always cross-check local supply and local housing allowance limits before committing. The housing story is one of many places where the gap between policy projections and actual outcomes has grown wide. And housing is far from the only sector where expectations set just a few years ago now sit uncomfortably beside present-day data. Post-Brexit trade, the hangover stage. When the UK voted to leave the EU, official forecasts in 2018 cast the coming decade as a chance to reshape its place in world trade. Gains from faster-growing markets beyond Europe, offsetting any loss of frictionless EU access, were supposed to come quickly. Free trade agreements would be struck on more favorable terms than those negotiated as part of the bloc. Supply chains, it was assumed, would absorb the change with minimal disruption. By 2025, the contrast between those projections and reality is plain. Independent forecasters, including the Office for Budget Responsibility, still model Brexit as reducing long-run trade intensity by around 15% and cutting long-run productivity by roughly 4% compared with remaining in the EU, an ongoing drag on both exports and investment. The EU is still the UK's largest single trading partner, but goods now cross that border with a level of friction most businesses haven't dealt with for decades. Extra certificates, customs declarations, and regulatory checks add time and cost at every stage. For perishable items, such as fresh seafood or chilled meat, the hours lost can shift a delivery from profit to loss. Routes that once ran directly from UK factories to European distribution hubs now require contingency plans for inspections, documentation training for drivers, and often more expensive logistics contracts. For EU buyers, these extra costs make UK products less competitive against alternatives made within the single market. Imports have also become more complicated. Small and medium-sized firms that source components from Europe face higher transport charges, delays, and in some cases supplier surcharges to cover the additional hassle of serving UK customers. While global cost pressures affect many goods, ONS data and industry surveys point to customs complexity as a consistent factor in price increases across categories from electrical appliances to clothing. In Q2 2025, ONS figures showed export volumes rising by 1.6% and imports by 1.4% compared to the previous quarter. But that quarter-to-quarter movement sits within a wider post-Brexit pattern of reduced trade intensity. Smaller exporters have been hit hardest. Surveys show that compliance paperwork, duplicate certification, and altered rules of origin make the economics of some transactions unworkable at modest scales. A Yorkshire-based artisan food producer, for example, reported spending weeks securing additional documentation to send small consignments to long-standing customers in France and Belgium, an administrative burden that larger competitors can absorb with dedicated staff. For some firms, the only viable solution has been setting up EU-based storage or distribution points, keeping customers supplied but shifting parts of their operation and associated jobs out of the UK. Regulatory divergence has added another layer of cost. Products designed to UK-specific rules often need redesign or recertification to reach EU markets, doubling development work. Sectors with rapid turnovers, such as consumer electronics or medical devices, find these delays especially damaging. By the time a product reaches EU shelves, rival firms based inside the bloc may have already taken the next step forward. Government announcements about new trade agreements are positioned as evidence of offsetting these losses. Deals signed with partners in Asia, the Pacific, and the Americas feature prominently in ministerial briefings. Many, however, are continuity agreements carried over from EU membership with minor adjustments, or new arrangements whose GDP impact is projected to be small compared to the estimated losses from reduced EU trade. Studies comparing terms show that in some cases, UK deals secure less favorable conditions than the EU's agreements with the same markets, particularly in tariffs for certain goods and access for services. Those limitations rarely feature in the political messaging. Services, which make up a large share of the UK's exports, have also been affected. London's financial, legal, and professional firms remain internationally active, but without automatic single-market access, they now navigate more licensing requirements and sometimes establish EU subsidiaries. That keeps client relationships intact, but erodes the efficiencies of a single home-base operation. Smaller service providers, niche consultancies, boutique legal practices, often lack the resources to duplicate their presence and have withdrawn from EU markets rather than take on the extra cost and complexity. Food trade underlines how these changes filter into everyday prices. The UK still sources most of its imported food from the EU. Each added charge, inspections, haulage delays, energy costs, feeds into the retail price. For products assembled in UK facilities, ingredients may face separate clearance processes, each adding to the final cost. For households, these increases are part of broader cost of living pressures. For businesses, they are a squeeze on thin margins. Some adaptation is possible. Companies switch to domestic suppliers where available, change product specifications, or source from non-EU markets. But not every input can be switched, especially in industries dependent on materials or specialist components with no domestic production base. New overseas suppliers bring their own risks. Inconsistent supply, different quality standards, or higher financing costs, all of which can undermine longer-term stability. Behind the daily operational challenges is a consistent macro-level theme. Many post-Brexit free trade agreements have limited impact in offsetting the losses from increased EU trade friction. Independent assessments find projected GDP gains from these new deals to be fractions of the long-term hit modeled by the OBR from leaving the single market and customs union. While a few sectors benefit from tariff reductions or modest access improvements, there has been no transformative shift to new sources of growth. For most cross-border businesses, the core experience is one of added friction. Higher transaction costs, slower delivery times, and more complex compliance obligations are treated as a permanent part of operating reality rather than temporary teething problems. Larger firms can restructure or pass on costs. For smaller players, the choice is often between scaling back international ambitions or absorbing costs that erode profitability. In political discourse, sovereignty and trade independence are emphasized as strategic gains. Yet the gap between rhetoric and sector-level data is wide. Annual trade statistics repeat the same structural story. Reduced goods exports to Europe, increased costs in multiple import categories, and cautious investment sentiment among firms tied into cross-border supply chains. The quick adjustment period anticipated by some has faded into a protracted phase of structural disadvantage relative to EU membership. The post-Brexit trade environment is not defined by a single collapse point, but by the steady accumulation of small losses and additional costs. In sectors where margins were already thin, those pressures hasten consolidation or exit. In others, they narrow the options for expansion, innovation, or hiring. The new trade deals secure access to a range of markets, but in most cases without the same ease or scale once available. Where UK firms hold on to market share, it is often through costlier, more complex arrangements. These trade realities shape the wider economic context in ways that go beyond container ports and customs offices. One of the most persistent effects is on where investment happens, and that includes investment in people. As firms adjust to thinner margins and more complicated export routes, their hiring strategies and skills development budgets shift, influencing who they employ, where, and on what terms. The consequences are becoming visible in unexpected parts of the labor market, in patterns that point to another kind of economic leakage that is harder to track through official trade statistics. The great remote work brain drain. Remote hiring from foreign firms has surged. Many UK professionals now work remotely for overseas employers, creating a new form of brain drain that keeps talent physically in the UK, but economically tied to other countries. Unlike the old pattern of skilled workers emigrating, this shift happens without anyone booking flights or packing boxes. People remain in British cities, paying rent or mortgages here, while their skills, ideas, and daily output flow directly into foreign economies. For employers abroad, it's an ideal arrangement. Direct access to trained British talent without renting offices or navigating UK employment rules. For Britain, it's an outflow of human capital that isn't captured in most migration statistics and rarely features in policy briefings. The mechanics are straightforward. High-speed internet, reliable collaboration platforms, and a normalization of fully remote roles have made this possible at scale. What started as a pandemic-induced stopgap is now embedded into recruitment strategies for tech firms, creative agencies, and research outfits worldwide. A Bristol-based programmer might be salaried by a Canadian fintech, earning more in sterling terms than most local rivals can offer. A Glasgow designer could be producing entire campaigns for a New York agency without a single UK-based client in her portfolio. Industry surveys and recruitment reports show roles in technology and creative disciplines are the most exposed to this kind of international hiring, leaving domestic employers struggling to match pay and retain staff. The financial upside for individuals is obvious. Incomes can jump when working for US or Swiss companies that operate on higher salary bands than British firms, especially outside London. Freelancers find rates more sustainable. Contractors can cherry-pick projects from global marketplaces. Domestic wage structures often can't compete. But there's a national trade-off. Every professional who takes a full-time overseas contract is one fewer person available to drive growth inside British companies. Employers either raise salaries to keep pace, squeezing already thin margins, or accept reduced capability. Over time, this undercuts local firms' ability to compete on innovation. Small and mid-sized businesses carry the heaviest burden. Large multinationals can occasionally match foreign pay scales to keep key staff, but regional engineering consultancies, marketing agencies, or biotech startups generally can't. If a developer in Leeds can earn 40% more for an American employer while working from home, staying local is a hard sell. Multiply that across thousands of professionals in AI, advanced manufacturing design, or life sciences, and the result is a sustained talent shortage with no easy recruitment fix. The wider cost is measured not just in headcount, but in the weakening of local ecosystems. When top graduates from UK universities are hired straight into overseas remote jobs, they're not building domestic networks, mentoring junior colleagues in British offices, or founding spin-out ventures here. Local firms miss out on mentorship, spin-out companies, and the multiplier effects that keep innovation ecosystems alive, a slow leak of comparative advantage. Taxes on their earnings may still be paid in the UK, but the intellectual property and strategic value they generate accrue elsewhere. Technology and creative industries are among the most heavily affected. Software engineers, data scientists, and robotics specialists find cutting-edge work with better pay through contracts from Silicon Valley or Singapore rather than in Cambridge or Birmingham. Creative professionals, from animators to digital campaign strategists, now receive pitches directly from global agencies that have learned they can bypass certain costs by hiring UK workers remotely. The consistency and quality of British training in these sectors make them attractive targets for recruiters abroad. Universities contribute to the cycle unintentionally. Students in high-demand fields leave graduation ceremonies to job offers from abroad that beat anything domestic employers have prepared. Alumni who might once have recycled expertise back into British R&D clusters are increasingly working in distributed teams headquartered elsewhere. This erodes the feedback loops that helped maintain strengths in sectors like pharmaceuticals, film production, or gaming. From the viewpoint of individual workers, these contracts make sense. They bring higher pay, flexible hours, and insulation from location-based costs like expensive commutes or London rents. But each worker who exits the domestic talent pool makes it harder for UK-based companies to assemble competitive teams. In some cases, those firms give up on filling local roles entirely and outsource work overseas, reinforcing the same dynamic that took their staff away in the first place. The change is visible on the ground in co-working spaces and home offices. Tech hubs in Manchester house professionals whose colleagues are scattered across continents. At Creative Meet UPS, you can meet art directors with no UK clients at all. They live here, spend some income locally, but in operational terms their working lives function as part of other countries' economies. Government responses lag behind the trend. Skills shortage analyses still focus on physical emigration and regional unemployment, overlooking this version of brain drain that doesn't show up in flight statistics. Any credible plan to grow advanced manufacturing, green industries, or game development hinges on access to specialist staff. That access now competes with global markets unhindered by the barriers of the past. Ironically, Britain's own selling points, fast digital infrastructure, time zone overlap with Asia and North America, and relatively competitive labor costs, are the same traits that make it easy for overseas companies to hire here without setting foot in the country. From their perspective, recruiting a UK-based engineer is as straightforward as hiring locally. And for many roles, British rates, even after the overseas uplift, remain below those in the employer's home market. The long-term risk is gradual erosion rather than sudden collapse. When enough sector-defining work is being performed for overseas employers, the critical mass that supports domestic ambitions starts to thin. Collaboration slows, specialist clusters fragment, and local firms narrow their horizons because they can't count on retaining the people needed for bold projects. It lowers the ceiling for what can be achieved. Workforce data in 2025 shows the heaviest concentration of these remote overseas roles in STEM and creative professions, precisely the areas most touted as future growth drivers. That means a growing share of the value those roles create leaves the UK in economic effect, even if the people remain residents. The individual decision to take the higher offer is rational. The aggregate effect is less healthy for the country's ability to compete. If you're in tech or a creative field, remote foreign offers may pay more in the short term. Weigh that against long-term career mobility, differences in pensions or benefits, and where you want to establish professional networks. Those choices shape not just personal futures, but the opportunities available to the next wave of skilled workers. These income shifts and career paths feed into broader patterns that go well beyond the job market, influencing where wealth accumulates, who gains from economic growth, and who feels left behind. That imbalance is now showing up in ways economists once framed as unlikely warning signs rather than real-world data points. Inequality at record levels. In 2025, the UK's wealth distribution sits at one of its most imbalanced points in decades. Wealth is highly concentrated. The top 10% own the majority of the country's wealth, and research shows the richest 50 families alone hold more than the poorest half of the population combined. Equality Trust data indicates the top fifth take around 36% of all income and control about 63% of national wealth, placing the UK among the more unequal OECD nations. For viewers, this isn't just a statistic. It influences mortgage access, wage growth for younger professionals, and even the degree of trust in political promises. The concentration of wealth shapes consumer demand in ways that entrench the divide. Households in the lower half of the distribution have limited discretionary income once essentials are covered, depressing demand for retail, hospitality, and local services in their areas. In contrast, affluent districts sustain high-margin businesses insulated from the cost pressures affecting much of the country. The result is a feedback loop where investment and new business formation cluster in places already rich in customers with high spending power, while less wealthy areas see fewer openings and slower growth. Political confidence erodes in this climate. For people who have seen little improvement in their own finances despite decades of growth headlines, policy pledges feel remote from everyday experience. When structural inequality is this visible, promises about national prosperity ring hollow if they do not deliver tangible change at the household level. Governments face an uphill battle in winning public support for reforms that might require short-term sacrifice when day-to-day affordability already dominates decision-making. Generational divides underscore the problem. Younger workers are more likely to rent well into their 30s, service student debt, and miss out on defined benefit pensions. The most reliable wealth-building channel of past generations, home ownership, is now often unreachable without significant family help. ONS housing affordability figures show the median home in England costs about 7.7 times median full-time earnings, locking out those without intergenerational support. Where family assistance is available, it tends to come from households already positioned near the wealthier end of the spectrum, perpetuating advantages within the same groups and regions. The strain shows in mundane details of urban life. In some city centers, a basic lunch can cost £8 or more, an afterthought for those earning six figures, but a notable slice of the daily budget for someone on £23,000 a year. Ticket prices for cinemas, gym memberships, and other routine activities have risen beyond what many can justify, turning everyday leisure into a discretionary expense for all but the comfortable. Childcare costs, often matching or exceeding mortgage payments, impose further constraints on working-age households outside the wealthiest deciles. Commuting patterns make these differences visible. Workers crowd trains and buses into affluent districts they cannot afford to live in, while those streets host boutiques, high-end restaurants, and estate agencies catering to households for whom expensive purchases are routine. The divide is geographic as well as economic, mapping specific postcodes to concentrated financial power and areas of persistent low opportunity. These disparities exist within cities as much as between them. In London, boroughs like Kensington, Westminster, and parts of Camden have average household wealth in the millions, with commonplace spending on private education, second homes, and international travel. A few miles away, other boroughs record above-average poverty rates, overcrowded housing, and reliance on public services under mounting strain. The postcode lottery in wealth and opportunity reflects and reinforces where investment flows. Asset performance makes the divide even sharper. Properties and investments in high-wealth districts tend to appreciate faster, partly because they attract larger transactions and benefit from sustained demand. These gains layer atop pre-existing wealth, widening the gap with areas where property values climb more slowly or fail to keep pace with inflation. Those without assets fall further behind, while those with them see compound growth. Families in affluent areas can channel resources into education, healthcare, and travel that expand opportunities and resilience over time. Families outside those areas face harder trade-offs over essentials, limiting investment in their own or their children's longer-term prospects. These differences affect health outcomes, educational attainment, and employability, feeding directly back into income potential and keeping the gap self-perpetuating. Even public amenities reflect inequality. High-income districts can sustain well-maintained parks, cultural venues, and frequent transport links, funded partly through local tax revenue and private donations. Poorer areas often see facilities decline or close when council budgets tighten, lacking the private inflows that can supplement public provision. These differences shape the lived environment in ways that further cement geographic divides in desirability and opportunity. The financial system amplifies the imbalance. Wealthier households can access lower borrowing costs, investment products with better returns, and tailored financial advice. Those on lower incomes pay more proportionally for credit, face higher insurance costs in some areas, and have far fewer tools to cushion against setbacks. Climbing into higher wealth brackets becomes harder, even for skilled workers, when the starting point carries higher financial friction. Business strategies adapt accordingly. Retailers and service providers target high-spending areas, while closing locations in less profitable regions. Supermarkets, for example, may launch premium stores in wealthy postcodes while budget-only options dominate in poorer zones. In some communities, closures create retail deserts, where residents have less choice and often pay more for basics due to reduced competition. The commercial landscape mirrors the wealth distribution. These conditions create a divide in how economic change is experienced. A given inflation rate might be an inconvenience in wealthy enclaves, but a serious strain elsewhere. That shapes political priorities and willingness to accept wider economic measures. One group can tolerate shocks, the other must guard against them daily. As wealth growth concentrates geographically, the benefits of national economic expansion become more contained. Jobs in high-value sectors like finance boost spending within a few postcodes, while tourism and infrastructure spending often reinforce established hubs, leaving regional economies largely untouched. The reality in 2025 is not universal poverty outside these enclaves, but constrained upward mobility for most, alongside accelerating gains for a small share at the top. The overlap between postcode, household wealth, and generational prospects is tightening. On paper, these are data points in a distribution chart. In practice, they decide who can buy a home, launch a business, or accept an unpaid internship, and which communities will continue to grow while others struggle to hold on. This tightening of advantage has a direct bearing on the country's capacity to manage economic transitions. When resources, influence, and opportunity are this concentrated, the pathways into the industries shaping the next wave of growth become narrow and selective. Who controls access to those paths, and how widely they are opened, will determine how the benefits and costs of emerging economic changes are distributed. AI and automation. Who wins and who gets left behind? The distribution of gains from artificial intelligence and automation in the UK is following a familiar pattern. Concentrated benefits for some, disruption for others. Analysts report that AI and automation are reshaping tasks in sectors from finance to professional services, while leaving large parts of the economy largely untouched. These changes are not only about who can access advanced technology, they also reflect sector-specific investment capacity, corporate priorities, and the presence or absence of coordinated workforce support. In high-investment industries, AI opens new revenue streams and streamlines operations. Elsewhere, it accelerates the removal of certain types of work without offering clear, equivalent routes back into skilled employment. Professional services show how this can play out. In law, for example, AI tools can now scan, summarize, and cross-reference contracts at a speed once unimaginable for junior staff. Large firms report efficiency gains and cost reductions, but industry observers note that entry-level routes for law graduates are becoming narrower. Those pathways were where new solicitors developed the practical skills to progress. Without them, early career experience risks becoming concentrated among a smaller group already positioned to secure client-facing work, delaying or blocking advancement for others. In logistics and shipping, port operators who have invested in automated cranes, guided vehicles, and AI-driven scheduling systems report faster turnaround times and reduced error rates. These systems mean fewer routine manual tasks, and the operational teams required to run them are smaller. While these examples do not apply to every port, the direction of travel is clear. Where automation is rolled out extensively, employment opportunities in traditional roles shrink. Associated local industries, catering, maintenance, haulage, can feel the downstream effects if overall headcount falls. Retail adoption is less visible, but increasingly significant. AI-powered stock management and demand forecasting help large chains cut waste and improve margins. Automated checkouts, now linked with AI-based loss prevention, reduce the number of cashier shifts available. Remaining roles often demand technical troubleshooting skills rather than customer service alone, presenting challenges for workers whose experience is built in non-technical environments. These shifts don't remove every job in their category, but they subtly change the nature of work and the qualifications needed to secure it. The speed and extent of adaptation vary sharply across the economy. Financial services have integrated AI into fraud detection, real-time risk assessment, and client recommendation systems. Productivity improvements in these high-income sectors can be large enough to register in national figures, but the effects are concentrated in well-resourced firms clustered in London and other financial hubs. Meanwhile, many small and medium-sized enterprises lack the capital to adopt comparable systems, even where potential gains are well understood. The result is that the advantages accrue where resources already exist, reinforcing geographic and sector imbalances. Manufacturing illustrates the other side of the equation. A small number of advanced plants use AI-driven quality control and predictive maintenance to stay competitive, but most smaller manufacturers cannot fund these upgrades without targeted support. This leaves them more vulnerable to losing ground against better-equipped rivals at home or abroad. Without intervention, regions heavily reliant on such firms risk further industrial decline as competitive gaps widen. Healthcare offers a mixed case. Some NHS trusts use AI to assist in diagnostics, triage, and scheduling, leading to quicker scan turnarounds and better distribution of specialist workloads. But long-standing funding pressures, fragmented IT systems, and staff shortages limit wider adoption. Countries that combine investment in technology with parallel investment in training and system integration see larger, faster gains. In the UK, the technology often arrives without the full support structure needed to maximize its potential. The geography of AI benefits reflects these divides. London and a few university-linked tech clusters see the bulk of job creation in AI-related roles: developers, data scientists, product managers. In post-industrial towns, automation is noticed mainly through the disappearance or transformation of routine jobs, without new local employers ready to absorb displaced workers. This is compounded by uneven educational provision. Specialized AI skills are mostly taught in higher education or through private courses, which many cannot access. By the time new training filters through, industry needs may already have shifted. Where firms can invest, AI has delivered clear operational wins. Grocers adjust supply to micro-seasonal demand. Insurers detect unusual patterns in claims sooner, and energy companies anticipate maintenance needs before failures occur. These examples underscore the potential, but with adoption so concentrated, the UK's overall AI-driven productivity still lags behind peers that combine take-up with broad workforce transition support. This uneven pattern also carries competitive risks. Other countries building both the technology and the talent pipelines can export not just goods but training programs, services, and intellectual property tied to AI. If UK firms cannot fill advanced roles locally, they may outsource or relocate work, losing the associated tax revenues and local spending. That erosion is gradual but real, especially in high-value niches. International comparisons are instructive. Germany's national retraining schemes, co-funded with industry, aim to move workers into growth sectors before job losses bite. Canada invests in mid-career reskilling to smooth transitions. In the UK, support exists, but it is fragmented and often too small-scale to meet the pace of change. For workers, the most effective hedge is to build transferable competencies such as data literacy, systems thinking, or process design, skills applicable across roles and sectors, rather than training tied only to a specific task that may be automated. The uneven adoption of AI risks becoming another driver of broader inequality. In thriving sectors and regions, automation can increase efficiency and profitability, creating a virtuous circle of reinvestment. In others, it accelerates job loss without creating enough replacement opportunities to sustain incomes and local economies. Bridging this gap requires deliberate coordination between government, industry, and education providers, aligning incentives to spread the gains more evenly and preparing those most exposed to automation to transition into stable, well-paid roles. For policymakers, the priority is clear: target retraining funds towards sectors and communities where automation risks are highest, and ensure pathways exist for workers to enter growth industries quickly. For employers, investing in workforce transition reduces the long-term costs of talent shortages. For individuals, developing adaptable, tech-fluent skill sets now can protect future earning power and broaden career options. Artificial intelligence in the UK has proven it can raise productivity, but so far those gains sit in a small number of sectors and locations. Without matching investment in people and broader diffusion of technology, it will reinforce the same regional and sectoral divides already straining the economy. And as with any structural change, those economic imbalances will collide with other national priorities that demand both money and attention, especially in areas where long-term investment competes with short-term political pressure. Climate costs and the Economic Balancing Act. In recent years, government climate spending and energy support have both become large, politically visible budget items, creating a tension between near-term household energy costs and long-term adaptation investments. This is no longer an abstract part of the budget. It is a line item that shapes daily costs for millions. These policy trade-offs show up in monthly public finances and in political debate, with voters far more aware of their immediate bills than of long-term savings from damages avoided. For viewers, that means household bills and tax choices are a battleground, and knowing which policies are one-off relief measures versus those building resilience will help you make sense of political announcements. The outlay covers more than subsidies for wind and solar farms. A large share is directed to physical resilience, shoring up flood defenses in coastal towns, engineering barriers against more frequent tidal surges, strengthening infrastructure to cope with heavy rainfall, and building systems to manage drier summers in the southeast. These measures are positioned as investments to protect people, property, and economic activity for decades. Yet each requires upfront spending that turns into a political flashpoint when household energy charges or visible tax burdens rise. Funding comes through a mix of public borrowing, levies embedded in energy bills, and direct subsidies drawn from general taxation. This makes the cost difficult to ignore. A resident may see it in the energy standing charge, in their annual council tax adjustment, and in broader tax policy. Even households supportive of climate action report frustration at these upfront costs, especially since energy represents a bigger proportion of budgets for lower and middle-income groups. The result is that a collective risk management strategy is often perceived through the lens of individual affordability. This disconnect fuels policy instability. Over the past 5 years, net zero targets have been set, adjusted, delayed, and reinstated in quick succession. Efficiency standards for new-build homes have been announced and pushed back. Offshore wind auction timetables have been accelerated, then partially withdrawn, citing market constraints. Each shift sends the sector back to its spreadsheets, recalculating viability under altered assumptions. Developers and suppliers frequently hold capacity idle until rules settle, raising costs and reducing the speed of deployment. The public stance is not uniformly hostile. Polling still finds strong support for reducing emissions and preparing for climate impacts. The difficulty is political. The costs are tangible now, while the benefits are deferred and often intangible. A higher electricity bill is a concrete loss this year. The avoided damage from a future flood, or the stability of agricultural output 2 decades later, is invisible to the household making trade-offs today. Politicians have a harder time claiming credit for disasters prevented than for services delivered. Adaptation spending reflects acceptance that impacts are no longer distant possibilities. In East Anglia, coastal reinforcement work has expanded where once in a century, surges are happening more often. Some major cities have commissioned upgrades to stormwater drainage and water storage after repeated urban flooding. Agriculture subsidies now support switching to crop types more resilient to new rainfall and temperature patterns across different regions. These interventions are costly to initiate, but often cheaper than the price of inaction. Economic modeling generally supports early investment. Independent research groups calculate that the avoided costs of extreme weather events can outweigh preparation spending by several multiples. Reinforcing a flood barrier can avert billions in losses from a single severe incident. Heatwave early warning systems can cut mortality and reduce hospital strain. Expanding offshore renewable capacity can insulate consumers from imported fossil fuel price shocks. Yet such avoided losses do not appear in annual fiscal statements. They remain hypothetical events in the public view, even if the probabilities behind them are rising. Because they are unseen, these benefits are politically fragile. Climate spending is often treated as optional when ministers look for budget space, especially under wider fiscal pressure. The temptation to cut or delay is strong during periods of high inflation or when interest payments on national debt consume a bigger share of revenue. Short-term political optics reward visible cuts in bills over long-term risk reduction. The energy generation side of the budget faces parallel issues. Renewable builds have accelerated compared with a decade ago, but the infrastructure to transmit and balance that power lags. Some wind capacity waits months or years for connection because of grid bottlenecks. Removing these choke points demands new cabling, substations, and control systems, all of which are ultimately funded via consumer bills. Technically, upgrading the grid is a prerequisite for maximizing renewable value. Politically, it risks backlash when costs rise without obvious immediate gains. Where climate investments do land, benefits can be unevenly distributed. Areas hosting substantial renewable projects or major adaptation works often see new jobs, improved local infrastructure, and some boosts to secondary business. Communities with little direct project activity, meanwhile, may only experience the costs, stoking perceptions of unfairness. This is sharper in rural or coastal places outside high investment zones, where residents are asked to pay for a transition they don't see firsthand. From a macroeconomic standpoint, consistent capital spending on green and climate-resilient infrastructure can stimulate manufacturing, engineering, and construction, while improving the trade balance by reducing fossil fuel imports. Achieving these benefits depends on stability. Stop-start policy cycles deter long-term planning, limit private co-investment, and allow overseas competitors to claim a greater share of emerging green technology markets. Yet climate programs share the same fiscal space as health, transport, education, and debt servicing. In political terms, the climate line is easier to squeeze in the short term, because cutting it does not immediately close a hospital ward or cancel school transport. The fact that damage from reduced resilience often arrives years later provides cover for deferral, even if the long-term cost is higher. For those assessing the hard numbers, the case for continued investment is clear. Actuarial-style risk assessments can quantify the property value at risk from floods, the potential GDP loss from supply chain interruptions after storms, or the mortality and healthcare burdens from severe heat. Without current spending, those figures climb. In a strict economic sense, money invested now is money saved later, even though those savings are costs that never materialize on a ledger. This divide between economic logic and political timing is why climate and energy spending remains volatile. The sums are measurable in the budget, the avoided losses are robust in aggregate projections, but the negative feedback from even small increases in bills or taxes is immediate. The policy narrative tends to cycle through ambitious pledges, partial rollouts, and retrenchment under pressure, without changing the core tension. The UK is paying now to avert bigger climate-related costs later. Where these spending choices become even more contested is when they must be weighed against other urgent public priorities. Budgets are finite, and any decision to protect or expand climate investment potentially narrows fiscal room elsewhere. That competition plays out not just in cabinet discussions and budget statements, but in the public services people rely on every day. The NHS crisis price tag. Among the public services now under the greatest strain, the NHS stands out both for the human cost and the scale of the economic fallout. In 2025, waiting times for critical treatments are among the longest on record. For routine operations like hip and knee replacements, waits of a year or more are common in many regions. In parts of England, referrals for key diagnostic scans can take over 6 months, and even urgent cases compete with heavy backlogs. Staff-to-patient ratios are stretched thinner than at any point in recent memory, so queues grow even for treatments where short delays can alter medical outcomes. The visible issue is the growing list of people in need, but the hidden economic cost runs much deeper. ONS data for Q2 2025 showed that output in human health and social work activities rose by 1.1% over the quarter, evidence that government health spending is rising, yet the extra activity still cannot meet demand. More people are caught in months-long limbo, trying to stay in work while managing chronic illness or injury. The job they hold doesn't have to be physically intensive to be affected. Persistent pain, restricted mobility, or untreated conditions can make any role less sustainable. For employers, this means higher sick leave, lower productivity, and increased costs for covering staff absences. Across the economy, those lost workdays add up to billions in foregone output each year. One coping route for some households is to pay privately to speed up care. Private clinics report steady growth in self-funded patients who have abandoned NHS lists. Treatment often costs several £1,000s, paid for through savings if available, but more commonly via credit cards, personal loans, or by releasing equity in property. The short-term gain is restored health and the ability to work. The long-term cost is debt that diverts income from local spending into loan repayments. For those without spare assets or access to credit, this option simply doesn't exist, deepening the divide in both recovery time and economic opportunity. If you or your family are affected, private treatment or employer-provided healthcare may help in the short term, but both come with financial and equity trade-offs. JRF's UK Poverty 2025 analysis underscores that demand on services is rising fastest among households already facing hardship. Where private solutions are unaffordable, delayed treatment can push lower-income households toward long-term unemployment, while higher-income households are more able to buy their way back to full earning potential. Underinvestment feeds into this divide. When the wider economy underperforms, tax revenues grow more slowly, leaving less scope to expand NHS capacity. At the same time, untreated ill health reduces workforce participation and slows growth, narrowing the tax base further. It's a self-reinforcing cycle. Demand rises, resources lag, recovery rates fall, and pressure on services intensifies. Demographic trends make this harder to reverse. An aging population with more complex conditions, alongside improved survival rates from serious illnesses, means higher lifetime care requirements per patient. Staff shortages amplify the problem. Hospitals and GP practices are carrying vacancies across nearly every role, from consultants to nursing assistants. Recruitment from overseas continues, but competition from other countries and high domestic burnout are shrinking the pipeline. With fewer hands to share the load, each clinician manages a heavier caseload, raising risks of errors and prolonging treatment schedules. Retention is as critical as recruitment. Wages need to be competitive internationally, but working conditions matter just as much if experienced staff are to stay. The Treasury's own calculations show the economic case for closing these gaps. It is generally cheaper over time to maintain a well-staffed and efficient service than to absorb the productivity losses from untreated conditions. Early intervention reduces long-term care needs and helps prevent escalation into more expensive treatments. Yet in the political arena, this argument is often overridden by near-term budget pressures, especially when the costs of underfunding are dispersed across businesses, households, and regions rather than concentrated in a single line on the government's accounts. Official expenditure data shows health spending has risen in nominal terms, but real spending struggles to keep pace with the combination of rising costs and rising demand. The difference between what's budgeted and what's needed is the space where capacity erodes. Even when budgets expand by billions, they may only stabilize waiting times rather than shorten them. This helps explain why announcements of record health spending often produce little visible change for patients. Employers are adjusting in ways that create new divides. Some now offer private health cover in standard packages to compete for staff, even in roles that wouldn't have included such perks a decade ago. Larger firms can absorb or pass on the cost. Smaller firms often cannot, putting them at a disadvantage in recruitment. This mirrors the inequality seen in households. The capacity to bypass NHS delays is skewed toward those with greater resources. The strain is also evident in related sectors. Charities offering health advice or basic support have seen demand rise sharply. Mental health services increasingly deal with clients whose issues have been compounded by physical health delays. Local councils are allocating more resources to care services for residents whose conditions have worsened while waiting for treatment. Each of these reactions draws from other parts of the public budget, meaning NHS bottlenecks indirectly shape spending elsewhere. Within families, the effects are both practical and financial. A relative's long wait for surgery might force another to cut their hours, lose income, or take unpaid leave to provide care. Saving for a deposit or paying for education can be set back years by the financial knock-on effects of illness. These micro-level adjustments don't make headlines, but when repeated across thousands of households, they shape local economies and labor markets. Regional disparities in health service performance multiply the drag. Areas with the longest wait times have a larger share of their working-age population temporarily sidelined. Local businesses see less footfall and lower discretionary spending while communities absorb a quieter but sustained economic loss. This unevenness can entrench regional imbalances already visible in other economic indicators. The NHS is therefore more than a medical service. It is a key economic infrastructure. Long waits remove people from the productive economy, and costly private workarounds shift household spending away from goods and services into debt repayment. Closing the gap between demand and capacity requires multi-year consistency in investment, staffing, and system integration, measures that are harder to sustain when public finances are tight and political priorities change quickly. Without that sustained effort, the health system remains caught in a cycle where higher spending meets even faster-growing demand, delivering little visible relief. The economic price is paid in reduced productivity, lost earnings, stalled careers, and widening inequalities. That price doesn't stay inside the health budget. It influences broader fiscal pressures that shape decisions in every other area of public policy. Those pressures are becoming harder to ignore. Health costs, alongside other core services, now sit within a fiscal framework already carrying some of the heaviest obligations in modern times. Understanding how those obligations interact with the wider economy means looking at the weight of all government liabilities and the interest bill that comes with them. The debt dilemma. One of the other forces shaping the UK's economic capacity in 2025 is the amount it spends simply to keep existing obligations in good standing. Public sector net debt was about 96% of GDP in mid-2025, and interest payable on government debt was around £16.4 billion in June alone. Holding debt at that scale is not unusual by post-war standards, but what has changed is the cost of carrying it. After a decade when very low rates made borrowing relatively cheap, the increase in interest rates means every pound already owed now costs more each year to service, no matter what happens to growth. That higher baseline for debt interest changes the arithmetic of the budget. Sums that might once have been channeled into upgrading transport, investing in R&D, or expanding training programs now flow to bondholders. Debt servicing has shifted from a background obligation into one of the most prominent lines on the spending profile. It is not a transaction that leaves anything new behind. It is about meeting commitments from past decisions at the expense of resources for today's priorities. Past governments often argued that borrowing could be warranted if the money was invested in productive assets that would boost future GDP enough to make repayment easier. Large-scale infrastructure or energy projects can follow that model. But a significant portion of the current debt accumulation came from crisis responses. The financial crash, COVID-era measures, and energy subsidies, which left the state with bills to service but fewer durable revenue-generating assets. These interventions often provided short-term stability or relief, yet ended without creating ongoing economic returns. That composition matters because repayments now fall due without offsetting income streams from the original spending. Areas such as pensions, healthcare, and education are already bound by inflation-linked commitments and demographic pressures. The more that interest on debt grows, the less flexibility remains for discretionary investment. Ministers trying to address housing shortages, repair transport backlogs, or expand college places are bidding against higher debt costs within the same finite pool of flexible spending. This is where crowding out becomes visible. Departments have scaled back or deferred capital schemes not for lack of ideas, but because revised cost projections for borrowing undermine their feasibility. Pausing or downsizing a project mid-build brings its own costs. Dilution of economic impact, disruption for contractors, and missed opportunities for jobs and tax revenue. Slower growth then holds the debt ratio high, justifying caution on investment, and the loop continues. Communicating this dynamic is politically awkward. Households notice when taxes inch up or promised projects vanish, but there is no visible counterpart to the money flowing to creditors. The absence of new facilities or upgraded systems registers sharply in lived experience, while debt repayment remains abstract. Nonetheless, avoiding those payments is not a choice. Skipping them would undermine the UK's credit standing and make new borrowing more expensive. The structure of what is owed shapes how quickly budget pressure tightens. Short-term debt instruments need rolling over frequently, so higher rates feed through almost immediately. Longer-term bonds buffer the budget temporarily, but as they mature and are replaced at higher yields, debt servicing costs rise again. The increases that began a few years ago are still working their way through refinancing, meaning the full fiscal impact of the rate rises has not yet landed. Market perception is another constraint. Investors treat UK government debt as low risk in part because repayment is predictable and politics does not interfere with budgetary obligations. A perception that fiscal space is too narrow or that forecasts are unreliable could lead to lenders demanding higher returns to hold gilts. That would lock in even higher service costs. This is why governments talk about balancing short-term support with the need to protect room for long-term investment, and why the OBR and official forecasts matter for credibility with markets. One response is to argue for growing GDP faster than debt, so that the ratio falls over time. That is plausible if growth is driven by activity with a high multiplier and lasting impact. But if the only tools available require new borrowing, then the borrowed funds must deliver more value than they cost to maintain. Several recent years show the debt stock rising without comparable gains in GDP per head, underlining that not all borrowing contributes to a stronger fiscal position. Distinguishing between investment borrowing and emergency borrowing is central to managing this problem. Loans used to fund revenue-generating or cost-saving projects can, over time, lighten the debt burden as a share of GDP. Loans taken on to cover temporary consumption or subsidies expire, leaving no asset behind, but commit future budgets to service the debt. Unwinding that is harder because there is nothing to sell no direct return to harvest, only the obligation. These constraints narrow the available policy space. Aging demographics drive healthcare and social care demand upwards. Education and skills systems need sustained funding to match the labor market to future industries. Infrastructure gaps in energy, housing, and transport weigh visibly on productivity. Each of these areas competes not only with each other, but with the non-negotiable cost of interest. The longer high-interest costs persist, the greater the risk that they suppress exactly the investments that could lift growth and make debt easier to handle. Changing that trajectory means identifying expenditure that can be reprioritized towards high-return uses within current totals, and accepting that such decisions may conflict with delivering immediate, broadly shared giveaways. The trade-offs are rarely popular, but allowing investment to be squeezed year after year locks in slower growth and keeps debt service as a large share of spending. In purely fiscal terms, the UK is not unique in managing a high debt ratio. The difference lies in what the borrowing has produced and the rate at which carrying costs are rising. A steady portion of spending is now cemented into servicing obligations from measures that no longer influence economic capacity. Releasing pressure on that line can only come from stronger growth, lower rates, or a shift in the balance between consumption and investment in future budgets. High debt costs can squeeze public investment, which matters for jobs, housing, and services that directly affect you. Reconciling short-term political pressure with the long-term health of the balance sheet is less about one-time fixes and more about setting clear priorities over several budgets. How those priorities are chosen tells you whether policies are designed for stability over decades or built to satisfy in the moment, regardless of the later bill. In short, decades of policy choices, underinvestment in skills and infrastructure, over-reliance on London's financial sector, and uneven trade and housing reforms have left the UK structurally exposed. The ONS, OBR, and independent research point to the same pattern. Weak productivity, high inequality, and tight public finances are interconnected outcomes, not isolated problems. These conditions shape everything from wage growth to housing costs and the resilience of public services. If this video changed how you see jobs, housing, or savings in the UK, hit like and tell us in the comments which topic you want a practical, what you can do deep dive on next. We'll prioritize the most requested issue. And if you want one concrete step right now, review your financial buffer and local housing options, and consider building skills in sectors less exposed to regional downturns.